Our next speaker, Dr. Martha Hodes, will discuss Mourning Lincoln, the assassination beyond the headlines. Dr. Hodes has read hundreds of diaries and letters from that fateful spring and summer of 1865 to tell a story not only of shock and sorrow, but also of glee, anger, blame, fear, and hope. Dr. Hodes is a professor of history at New York University and is the author of several books. Her latest book, Mourning Lincoln, was called a stunning piece of research by the Wall Street Journal. She has won several awards for her written works and is a winner of New York University's Golden Dozen Award for Teaching Excellence. She serves as a consultant for documentaries, television, radio, and museums on many aspects of American history, and is an elected member of the Society of American Historians. Please join me in my welcome to Dr. Martha Hodes.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here at Gettysburg to be part of the Sesquicentennial Sacred Trust Book Talks. I've been teaching the Civil War for nearly 25 years. I call my course Race, Civil War, and Reconstruction because I want to draw students who care not only about battlefield tactics, which matter, but also about larger historical questions. I've always had a few lines in my lectures about Lincoln's assassination, but several years ago, I found myself taking a greater interest in this momentous event. I now trace that interest to September 11th, 2001. That Tuesday was the first day of the semester at New York University. The first plane hit the towers before I left my apartment, and the second as I was walking to class. 9/11 made me think about how people respond to transformative events on the scale of everyday life, which in turn conjured my faded memories of Kennedy's assassination. I was 5 years old in 1963. As a scholar of the Civil War, I began to wonder, what did people do at home, on the street, at work, with their families, by themselves, when they heard the news of Lincoln's assassination? I wanted to understand a catastrophic event on a human scale. I wanted to explore how responses in the spring and summer of 1865 illuminated larger national concerns, Black freedom and equality, the problem of national reunion, and the meaning of the Civil War. I decided to write Mourning Lincoln because books about the assassination have often drawn on public sources, sermons or newspaper accounts, official expressions of condolence. I also found that historians often gathered personal responses to the assassination by reading memoirs, crafted long after the immediate moment had passed. Now, all of these are fine sources, but no one had thought to read extensively through the diaries people kept and the letters they wrote during the pivotal hours, days, and weeks in the wake of Lincoln's murder. In researching and writing Mourning Lincoln, it became clear that personal responses to the assassination illuminated the roots of a long aftermath. In particular, personal responses illuminated irreconcilable visions of the nation's future after the Civil War. And yet, curiously, I found that many personal accounts, including those written at the time, portrayed a monolithic nation in mourning. Can you see the slide there? Yes, wonderful. What you see here is a mourning ribbon from the time with the words, "A nation's loss." Here's a page from a mourner's scrapbook. "The nation is weeping." Let me say a word about 9/11 again. In the days that followed the attack on the Twin Towers, it felt like the whole world was grieving and in shock. And that was how I remembered it when I thought back years later. Then when I was writing Mourning Lincoln, I dug out photographs I'd taken on September 12, 2001, of the makeshift memorials that mourners had created in New York City. And in those photos, I saw evidence of something else. I saw evidence of tension and contention. One sign called for peace, another for peace after payback. Messages calling for harmony were defaced with calls to war, in turn answered with cries for justice without revenge. Some signs spewed fury at the peacemakers, others warned mourners to distrust the media. While researching Mourning Lincoln then, I had to ask who exactly comprised the nation at the end of the Civil War. After 4 years of bloody conflict, was the nation once again and all of a sudden a single entity? Of course not. And of course not even North and South, as sections were of one mind. Lincoln's supporters encompassed black Northerners and black Southerners, and the majority of white Northerners. Lincoln's antagonists encompassed the vast majority of white Southerners and a significant minority of white Northerners. It was precisely this multi-vocal din of voices that interested me. So in dozens of archives over about 5 years, I read hundreds and hundreds of personal accounts from the spring and summer of 1865. I read Union and Confederate, black and white, soldiers and civilians, men and women, children too, rich and poor, well-known, unknown. What you see here is not untypical. So you can see on this page from a diary, under the second black line, the words, "Our loved president," and at 22 minutes past 7 o'clock, which was the hour of Lincoln's death on the morning of April 15th, you can see Lincoln's birth date, his age, the words, "a martyr to justice," and the words, or most of the words, "killed by the hand of an assassin." In the course of this immersion in diaries, letters, and other personal writings, I found quite a bit that surprised me, making clear that no matter how majestic and resplendent were the public ceremonies honoring Lincoln, this end-of-war moment was not a time of unity and closure. In the cacophony that ensued, people who disagreed about the meaning of the war talked past and over one another. The immediate aftermath of Lincoln's assassination, those hours, days, and weeks I found, were a key moment of intense strife that's been left out of the story, and a key moment that resonates into the present day. With Union victory and Confederate defeat that first week in April 1865, everything was at stake. Black freedom had been seized and delivered, but would it last? Peace would soon be declared, but could it endure? How could Confederates be brought back into the citizenry? Where and how would former slaves live and work? Could they become citizens too? What kind of nation would the people and their leaders create? 2 days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln addressed a crowd from the White House balcony. Of course, no one knew at the time that this would be his last speech. Reflecting on the nation's Reconstruction, Lincoln stated that he would prefer, that was his word, that voting rights be extended to black men who were, again, his words, very intelligent, and to those who serve our cause as soldiers. Well, that cautious suggestion irritated abolitionists. As a white New Englander wrote in her diary, why can't he cut down the whole tree instead of lopping off the branches? Unsurprisingly, the same suggestion that suffrage be extended to a select group of black men struck Lincoln's antagonists as entirely too revolutionary. That's when the young Shakespearean actor who stood in the crowd that evening vowed to kill the president. Among his exact words, according to a companion who stood with him that night, "Now by God, I'll put him through." When Booth fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head 3 nights later, it was Good Friday. So what you see here is a recreation of that scene. This is a popular image from the time. That same evening, one of Booth's conspirators, attacked Secretary of State William Seward in his bed at home in Washington. This image is from the National Police Gazette. Seward lived while the news of Lincoln's death spread through the telegraph wires and across the nation and the world. Here's a headline from a Massachusetts paper: "Terrible news, Lincoln dead, he is shot by an assassin." Now suddenly, new questions became pressing. What would become of the Emancipation Proclamation? What would President Andrew Johnson do? What would happen the next day? Trepidation for the future, I found, was particularly acute for African Americans. Now, it's true that black leaders had criticized Lincoln's hesitancy regarding emancipation early in the war, but Lincoln had been deeply influenced by the convictions of black and white abolitionists, including the more radical members of his own party. One 6-year-old boy down south, no doubt echoing the fear of grown-ups around him, asked if he would have to be a slave again. Now, I knew when I began my research that the principal responses of mourners would be shock and grief. People were astonished, astounded, stupefied. Those are the kinds of words I found in their writings. People wrote that word of Lincoln's death was like a dagger to a heart and a thunderclap from a clear blue sky. It was a dreadful dream, a play on a stage. Today we would say I felt like I was in a movie. It was a joke, a hoax, a lie. In particular for former slaves, it was a secesh lie. In other words, a lie propagated by secessionist whites. One former slave said that even the trees were weeping for Lincoln. Now, by the rules of dominant American culture, expressions of grief had to be properly controlled, especially by men. But at this moment, all the rules of decorum lost their power. Clergymen struggled to make it through their sermons, some unsuccessfully. As one parishioner wrote in a letter to his wife, "The minister broke down and the tears rolled down his cheeks. Union soldiers were also, in the words of one, weeping like children." But Lincoln's mourners, I discovered, were also angry. If another battle came to pass, one soldier wrote to his mother, their Confederate opponents would wish, he told her, that they had never been born. The men of the famous Black 54th Massachusetts, stationed in South Carolina, said to one another, "Now there is no more peace. Let us turn back again, load our muskets, and if necessary, exterminate the race that can do such things." For these men, and for white Union soldiers too, the Confederates were not merely enemies. They were a distinct race. Exterminate the race that can do such things. These kinds of expressions of wrath contradicted the proclamations of universal grief made by mourners, that everyone, everywhere, across the whole nation, even the whole world, was of one heart and mind. North and South are weeping together. Lincoln knew no North, no South, only his country. I found sentiments like that across many personal writings, but of course that wasn't true. Not at all. To begin with, if the assassination seemed the greatest possible tragedy for the Union, for the Confederacy, surrender remained immediate and disastrous. Indeed, many Confederates reveled in the assassination, blatantly contradicting news of North and South weeping together. From South Carolina, a young woman wrote in her diary about the attacks on Lincoln and Seward, calling the two men, her words, "a royal suite of imperial apes," and she thanked God for, her words again, "the first gleam of light in this midnight darkness." The darkness, of course, being surrender. Also in South Carolina, 17-year-old Emma LeConte was in the middle of a German lesson when someone interrupted to break the news. "Hurrah," she cheered into her diary, "old Abe Lincoln has been assassinated." You can see part of her diary here, a page from that day. The lesson forgotten, she flew home, that's the top line, and I've marked some of the words I will say with arrows, her heart beating with excitement. She stopped off first at her Aunt Josie's, whereupon everyone shouted, "What do you think of the news? Isn't it splendid?" They were all in a tremor of excitement. These kinds of divergent responses made for violent clashes between white Southerners and black Southerners. In Portsmouth, Virginia, for example, it was dangerous to venture out at night, one Northerner explained. In his words, since the assassination of the president and since the return of so many rebel prisoners. The fact was, Confederates were angry too. Consider a man named Rodney Dorman, an ardent secessionist and pro-slavery lawyer. Living in the Union-occupied city of Jacksonville, Florida, Dorman was thoroughly disgusted with Lincoln's mourners, and he didn't hold back in his private writings. As he looked around and saw black men in soldiers' uniforms, white people begging in the streets, and Northerners teaching black people to read and write, he could not contain his fury. Lincoln and white abolitionists were, in his words, and his diary is preserved in the Library of Congress in Washington, ignorant wretches, blaspheming hypocritical priests, craven-hearted knaves, contemptible pukes and cowards, desecrated, prostituted, and perverted. Now, there were also white Northerners who despised Lincoln. These were Lincoln's political opponents, the so-called Copperheads. As a well-to-do woman wrote of her Irish immigrant cook, Julia was laughing all day. They hate Lincoln for emancipating the Negroes, fearing we shall employ them and reduce their wages. Nor did all Union soldiers love Lincoln. To the dismay of their comrades, some laughed and clapped when they heard the news of the assassination. When word arrived among a Union regiment from Oregon, for example, one of the men announced, "I'm glad the old son of a bitch is dead." Meanwhile, Lincoln's mourners went to church on Easter Sunday, April 16th, and the crowds were unprecedented. From California to Kansas to Washington, up through New England, black churches and white churches were jammed with worshipers, eager to make sense of what felt incomprehensible, listening as their ministers tried to explain the assassination as part of God's divine plan for the nation's future. By the way, Confederates were also sure that the assassination was God's will. Rodney Dorman, for one, wrote in his Jacksonville diary that, his words, "The whole sanctimonious band of self-satisfied northern villains and hypocrites should tremble and repent." And Lincoln's mourners did tremble. Many took comfort in their ministers' explanations, but I was most interested in those who wrestled with God in the face of such an unprecedented calamity. "I cannot reconcile myself," one soldier admitted, stumped as to why the Almighty would take away the great Abraham Lincoln at the exact moment of victory. "I cannot believe it was for the best," he wrote. Lincoln's death was such an incredible atrocity, wrote a Quaker woman, that she wondered whether love and mercy still reign in heaven while such unprovoked wickedness walks the earth. I was also interested then to figure out who Lincoln's mourners blamed for the assassination. Reconciliation to the will of God did not, after all, exempt the guilty from facing justice. To be sure, nearly all wanted John Wilkes Booth to suffer for his crime, but most pointed to the Confederate leadership as the culprit, and many, I was intrigued to find, placed the blame squarely on the institution of slavery. At 7 o'clock in the morning, on April 15th, before Lincoln had even been pronounced dead, a German immigrant in New York City wrote, "It is slavery, slavery." He capitalized the word and capped its repetition with an exclamation point. All that day, the accusations continued in private writings. Lincoln had been sacrificed to slavery, taken by an agent of that accursed system of slavery and states' rights, killed by all the hate, wickedness, and guilt of slavery. All words I found in writings from that day. Now, at the same time, reading through so many diaries and letters, I realized that in order to understand personal responses to Lincoln's assassination, I had to grapple with the persistence of everyday life in the face of catastrophe. And this is one of the places where personal writings differ the most from public sources like sermons or newspaper accounts. I think the first time this struck me was when I read the diary of a 9-year-old boy from New Jersey who wrote that school had let out early on the day of the president's funeral, then added, "In the afternoon, I played ball." Now, mourners indulged in the idea that Lincoln's assassination had stopped the world. As a Boston minister put it, all things stood still when the president was killed. But reading through diaries and letters, I realized that just the opposite was true. Instead of everyday life coming to a halt, everyday life intruded into the cataclysmic event. I was surprised at just how much ink people devoted to daily trivia alongside their reactions to the assassination. Take the diary of Emily Davis, an African-American servant and student. After the funeral in Washington, Lincoln's remains were taken on a 2-week, 1,700-mile journey to be buried in Illinois, as I'm sure many of you know. When the train passed through Philadelphia, Emily Davis tried several times to view the body. Here are the pages of her diary. When she finally caught a glimpse after waiting in line for hours, she wrote that it was a sight worth seeing. Those words are in the third line down under the printed day and date. I know it's very faded. A sight worth seeing. But none of that stopped Davis from recording the activities of daily life. She wrote about visits with female friends. She wrote that she had a sore throat. She wrote about whether or not her suitor had come by. And that attention to daily life didn't diminish the meaning of Davis's tribute to Lincoln. We also know from the diary that her two brothers had fought in the war. She'd attended a Jubilee celebration for the Emancipation Proclamation, and she had listened to a lecture by Frederick Douglass only a few months earlier. By the way, men did the same thing. And here's one of my favorites, a rare self-conscious rumination on the immersion in everyday life as a form of consolation. From Ohio, a man named Frank LeBaron wrote to his friend Henry Morgan in Pennsylvania. Henry, who had fought here at the Battle of Gettysburg, was getting married, and Frank wouldn't be able to attend the wedding. Now, Henry and his fiancée had long ago set their wedding date for April 19th, 1865, and that, of course, turned out to be the day of President Lincoln's funeral in Washington. And that's the day Frank wrote his letter. I will shut my eyes to all tokens of mourning and close my ears to all sorrowful tollings, he wrote, and hear only joy bells because it is your wedding day. Frank tried mightily to stay on the happy topic, but pleaded that it had been ghastly to be plunged from the heights of joy following Union victory to the depths of sorrow by the horrible murder. Those are all his words. Now Frank confessed that he was glad for the distraction of Henry's wedding. I have not felt like myself since the assassination, he confided, and I am thankful for time away from it. To that end, Frank asked Henry to tell him all about the wedding, whether you behaved yourself or not, and how many mistakes you made in the service. Frank also wanted to know the most quotidian details, asking Henry about his new domestic life, including how your rooms look and what you can see from their windows. So mourners like these immerse themselves in the everyday as diversion from grief, but also for another purpose, as a means to embrace the way forward after Union victory. To face the future proved much more difficult for defeated Confederates, and most especially for former slaveholders. When a white Mississippi woman wrote that all are mourning and their hearts are crushed, President Lincoln was nowhere in her thoughts, as she went on in the next sentence to estimate that she had lost $65,000 worth of human chattel. Or as a white man in Tennessee wrote in his diary with no thought of Lincoln, with many aching hearts, we will mourn for many days, weeks, months, and years to come. In the ideal vision of Lincoln's mourners, the world had come to a standstill, time suspended, in order to allow proper grieving before turning to the Union's glorious future. Lincoln's enemies, on the other hand, didn't so much wish to stop time as they wanted to reverse time, taking them back to the antebellum South. Now, all of these responses to the assassination that I've just talked to you about, shock, sorrow, fear, fury, glee, the persistence of everyday life, all of these were deeply tied to visions of the nation's future, and in particular, as I noted at the outset, to clashing, irreconcilable visions of the nation's future. With Union victory, African Americans and their white allies looked forward to equality, education, land, citizenship, voting rights for black men, all with the guarantee of federal enforcement. Former Confederates, for their part, looked forward to the reestablishment of their own political rights with no federal interference. Thus did Lincoln's more radical mourners come to believe, very soon after his death, that God had permitted Lincoln's demise for a specific political reason. That is, in order to alert the victors to the intransigence of their defeated enemies. As one minister put it, without the assassination, the anti-slavery forces might not have realized the need for radical policies, like black suffrage in the aftermath of the war. Very rapidly, too, Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, made apparent his complete dismissal of black equality. Then I found African Americans just as rapidly reached for Lincoln. Black petitioners told President Johnson that he was replacing, these are their words, a man who has proved himself indeed our friend, reminding Johnson of the liberty brought us and our wives and our little ones by your noble predecessor. African Americans and their white allies now upheld Lincoln's visions as the model of a radical future of freedom and equality. They looked to the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, and they looked to the Gettysburg Address, where here, at the battlefield cemetery, Lincoln had proclaimed the nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and spoken of the nation's new birth of freedom. Those words are carved into the marble walls of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, a new birth of freedom. As you can see here, I'm sure many of you have been there. African Americans and their white allies also looked to Lincoln's last speech, despite the president's quite modest proposal, remember, that only very intelligent black men and black soldiers should be granted the vote. But Lincoln's more radical mourners also looked to a speech that had already become famous, the second inaugural address that Lincoln delivered 6 weeks before he was assassinated. The words of that speech, too, are carved into the walls of the Lincoln Memorial. Here is Lincoln at his second inauguration in early 1865 in front of the Capitol. He's standing where you see the gray circle marked. There, Lincoln had declared that the war on the battlefield would last, these are now famous words, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash, he meant slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, he meant the war. The war, he meant, would not end until slavery ended. Lincoln closed that address with the appeal, and these words were already famous when he was assassinated, here in Lincoln's handwriting, for malice toward none and charity for all, exhorting his listeners to strive on to finish the work we are in and to do all which may achieve a just and a lasting peace. Now, many at the time thought they knew what Lincoln meant, and many today, both historians and a more general public, understand these words in the same way. They understand them to mean that as the Union Army approached triumph, it seemed that Lincoln wanted his conquerors to treat their vanquished Confederate enemies with mercy. But after researching Mourning Lincoln, I came to disagree with that reading. Rather, I believe, African Americans, both North and South, interpreted Lincoln's imperative of malice toward none and charity for all to apply less to former Confederates and more the opposite, to apply to themselves, to former slaves, to African Americans in their quest for equality and citizenship. That's why Lincoln's black mourners inscribed those two phrases, malice toward none and charity for all, on the banner they carried to the nation's capital on the 4th of July, 1865, 150 years ago today. With Lincoln's imperative of a just and a lasting peace in mind, the famous black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, himself a runaway slave, told his fellow mourners on July 4th, 1865, that permanent peace could not be accomplished without justice. And justice in 1865 required going beyond legal freedom to encompass voting rights. Slavery, Douglass believed, his words, is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. And that's what Lincoln meant too, apparent in his call for the first steps toward black suffrage offered in his White House speech, the speech that the bullet of John Wilkes Booth transformed into his last public address. Or at least that was the case made by African American victors turned mourners when they looked to the spirit of the martyred president to realize their visions of freedom and equality. That's why Frederick Douglass concluded, in his words, "To the colored people, Lincoln's death was an unspeakable calamity." 2 years later, when the radical Republicans in Congress overrode the policies of President Johnson to implement their program of radical Reconstruction, Lincoln's mourners were not avenging Lincoln's death. Instead, as they had made clear in the aftermath of the assassination, they wanted to avenge secession and war and the cause of war, slavery, which they understood as well to be the cause of Lincoln's murder. Now, of course, that stunning moment of black equality and democracy known as radical Reconstruction was accompanied by the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And of course, with the end of Reconstruction in 1877 came the beginnings of Jim Crow segregation and lynching, when once radical white Northerners abandoned black equality for reconciliation with the white South. As I read through Confederate Diaries from the spring of 1865, I also unexpectedly found sentiments of these white Southerners from later decades. In 1905, Confederate veteran John Johnston, leafing through his Civil War diary, came across an entry from April 1865 in which he had prayed to God that the rumors of Lincoln's assassination were true. 40 years later, Johnson added a note on that same page, writing, "This was a sincere prayer." Well, by the turn of the new century, it seemed clear that the shot John Wilkes Booth had fired at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, was the first shot in the war that came after Appomattox. Before closing, I want to say a bit more about the 4th of July. On July 4th, 1865, 150 years ago today, an ordinary woman, a white woman named Anna Faris, a Quaker from Wilmington, Delaware, wrote in her diary about the meaning of the date, July 4th, for each year of the Civil War. July 4th in 1861, Civil War had just been declared. It seemed awful, Anna Faris recalled 4 years later, and we little knew what experiences were before us. July 4th, 1862. For this date, Anna Faris recalled Union distress and discouragement at the progress of the battlefield war. July 4th, 1863. For this date, she recalled her words, "the turning point in the war," which brought the tidings of our dear-bought but decisive victory at Gettysburg. July 4th, 1864. Now she recalled the rebels were burning the bridges and thundering at the gates of Washington in the vain hope of raising the siege of Richmond. And then for July 4th, 1865, she wrote, "Now we have victory and peace and feel thankful and happy, but not jubilant as we expected on account of the shadow of the president's assassination." And so to my final point. We cannot know what would have happened had Lincoln lived. We do know that the slain president's martyrdom permitted black Americans and their white allies to invoke his name in the quest for equality. In 2015, the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, we know also that this quest is not yet resolved. The meaning of the Civil War not yet resolved, which is why we turn with such intense interest to the legacies of President Abraham Lincoln and the legacies of the Civil War, why we're here today at the Gettysburg battlefield, learning, absorbing, and pondering the nation's history. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions or take comments or reflections, should anyone wish to speak. Yeah, please. So the question, in case anyone didn't hear, was the day before, great question, Lincoln was assassinated. What did people think of him? So wonderful question. Of course, Union victory had just come to pass within days before the assassination. So he was in many ways at a very high point in the eyes of his supporters. Now, even the so-called Copperheads, the Union soldiers and white Northerners who did not support a war against slavery, they still wanted the Union to be reunited. And they had re-elected Lincoln. The North had re-elected Lincoln with a great majority. But your question is interesting for another reason, which is you point to something that I found very interesting. I told you in my talk about Confederates, so I'm using your question as a jumping off point, Confederates who expressed glee at the assassination. at the same time the Confederates were expressing glee, they also had a sense that Lincoln was their best friend. And this was so fascinating to me. I thought Lincoln, as the Confederates' best friend, was a product of the late 19th century, kind of the birth of a nation era. If you've seen that movie, he's portrayed as, right, as the best friend. Well, I mean, we're talking the evening of April 15th, Confederates were saying, now what are we going to do? Lincoln was our best friend. And they were saying that because they believed that he would treat them with a certain lenience. So Lincoln was at this moment where he was, of course, had led the Union Army to victory, so a very high moment in the Northern opinion. And also, although Confederates both despised Lincoln and feared him, they also had a sense that he would treat them better, and this is so fascinating, than Vice President Andrew Johnson, right, who was known as someone who was very anti-slaveholder. So he had grown up in the South, in Tennessee and Kentucky, as a poor white Southerner, and he was known to hate the slaveholders. The funny thing is that Johnson turned out, in the end, to be more sympathetic to the slaveholders, probably than Lincoln would have been. Of course, we don't know. But overall, Lincoln, people would say, died at the right moment, if you will, at the very height of his popularity. I saw your hand up, sir, yes? Thank you.
Yes, earlier on you connected the assassination of Lincoln and the mourning with 9/11. As I was listening to you, I couldn't help but connect it with the assassination of Kennedy. Have you looked at, or has anyone that you know of looked at comparing the reaction to Lincoln's assassination with the reaction to Kennedy's assassination?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And so I think I mentioned very briefly in the talk that I was 5 when Kennedy was assassinated. So I have a very particular memory. I write about this in Mourning Lincoln. It's a very brief memory. But I have done some research and writing on Kennedy's assassination. And here's what I found really fascinating. 2 things. First of all, there was the same memory and the same sense among mourners that the whole nation was in grief. And yet, that wasn't entirely true either in 1963. So, in fact, what I found out by doing some research was that in Dallas, after Kennedy was shot, more and more troops were called out because people were fighting and arguing with each other. You know, Dallas was not particularly friendly to Kennedy, and that city is still struggling with that legacy. But there were fistfights in bars. There were people who were probably expressing some sort of glee, and they were not in the majority by any means, but there were enough that it was an issue. But the other thing that I found so fascinating was when Kennedy was assassinated, and I'm sure people here will have this memory, you turned on the television. Not everybody even had TVs in their homes in 1963, and so one of the major images you see, looking back at the historic photographs, are people standing, say, in front of appliance stores, watching television on the sidewalk, or people drove their cars off to the side of the road and turned the radio on. Well, what did people do? This is one of the things I wondered. No television, no radio, of course no cell phones, no internet. How did people respond at the immediate moment of Lincoln's assassination? Here was the difference. The most important thing to do when you heard news of Lincoln's assassination was to go outside and find someone else and look into people's faces. So over and over again, I write about this in the book, in diaries and letters, people will say, I walked through the streets, meeting the eyes of my neighbors and strangers. And if other people were crying, if men were weeping, if everyone looked somber and grave and shocked, then you knew it had happened. But aside from headlines and telegrams, which, by the way, during the Civil War were not always correct, there were many rumors, that was the way to verify that something had happened. The same way for Kennedy, we turned on the television and radio. And for 9/11, there weren't even smartphones in 9/11. By the way, we have to remember that. But there was much more internet and much more 24-hour news cycle. That was the other thing about 9/11. So I was fascinated by that very question of how the transmission of news evolved from these tragedies from one century and then decade to another. Thank you for that. Yes.
They issued 12 newspapers in the 12 hours between Lincoln's assassination and his death. So,
and that's also very interesting how there were so many newspapers in the 19th century, actually many more than there are today, of all persuasions. And in some ways this gets to the first question. And by the way, newspapers in the 19th century were very partisan. They were Republican or Democratic. They didn't pretend to be neutral. Many Democratic, in that case, anti-Lincoln papers, it was a mix. Some actually had gleeful headlines, and you can find those documents. But many also, in a kind of diplomatic sense, expressed a kind of reserved sorrow, because there was a sense that you had to be careful about what you were saying. And by the way, the Union soldiers who said things like, "I'm glad the old son of a bitch is dead," in the National Archives in Washington, this is where I found this information, there are thousands of pages of court-martial cases of these Union soldiers being brought up on charges of treason and slander and what was sometimes called being an accessory after the fact for maligning Lincoln at the moment of the assassination. So the other soldiers in a regiment will come forward and say, he said this, he said that. The soldier will come forward and defend himself. He'll say, "I was joking, I didn't mean it. Everyone knows I really am a good Union soldier." And then these men would be tried and often discharged dishonorably or sentenced to a year in prison or hard labor. So a fascinating set of documents of white Northerners who are maligning Lincoln at the moment of the assassination, which also kind of gets to the first question. Other thoughts? Oh, yes, please.
Just can't help asking this, and it's back to the parallel with Lincoln and Kennedy. I find it interesting, Lincoln Johnson, Kennedy Johnson. But beyond that, both Johnsons had this legacy to have to follow. Did you find the two to parallel at all in any way?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Andrew Johnson is consistently voted by the American public the worst president we've ever had. That's not even my opinion. That's just what everyone says. He really did, in many ways, try to reverse the legacy of Lincoln, and that's one of the reasons that the radical Republicans in Congress moved so far to become so radical, because they were trying to reverse what he was trying to reverse. Lyndon Johnson is more complicated. Now, I'm not a 20th century historian, but many would say that Johnson had a negative legacy in Vietnam, but a positive legacy on civil rights. And what's interesting about that, and there is a kind of interesting Lincoln-JFK parallel here, people remember JFK often as a civil rights president. And if you read, for example, letters that people wrote to Jacqueline Kennedy, African Americans wrote letters to Kennedy saying, that her husband was a man that they honored and trusted and hoped that he would make the world a better place for them. But in fact, Kennedy really hadn't done that much for civil rights at the moment of his assassination. He was young, whereas Johnson did accomplish quite a bit in terms of civil rights. And in that sense, Lyndon Johnson is quite different from Andrew Johnson. Thank you for that. Very interesting. Any other thoughts? Thank you so very much.